Mr. Jackson, if you'll raise your right hand, sir.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to give be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir, I do.
You can sit down. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson, our jury's out here today, so you need to speak loud enough and close enough to the mic that they can hear you. If you hear an objection, pause your testimony, and I'll tell you what to do. Okay, sir?
Okay.
All right, Mr. Williams.
Good afternoon. Would you state your name for the record?
Dylan Jackson,
Mr. Jackson, how are you employed?
with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office.
How long have you been working with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office?
Almost 8 years.
All right, and what's your title and duties for them?
Say again?
What do you do for them?
I'm an investigator with our narcotics division.
All right. Specifically, were you working there from 2016 to 2018?
Yes, sir.
All right, and at some point in there, were you a canine handler?
Yes, sir, I was.
Very generally, would you describe to the jury what that is?
It's where you work a single purpose is what I was working, German Shepherd. It's just single purpose narcotics dog.
When you say single purpose narcotics, suffice it to say, does that mean it only worked for drugs?
Yes, sir,
Correct?
that's correct.
Okay, that's all it was trained to
Yes.
alert on, correct?
Correct.
All right. Do you remember working with the defendant, Zachary Wester, when he was deputy in the sheriff's office?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall serving as a backup canine deputy for him related to the arrest of a Miss Kimberly Hazelwood on June 7th, 2018?
Yes, sir, I do.
Would you tell us how a dog alerts? And what I mean by that is specifically what factors play into whether a dog is able to make an alert, and then how a dog indicates that it is alerting.
So my dog, which was Canine Solo at the time, is a passive alert, which basically is when he's in odor of any kind of illegal narcotics that he's imprinted on, which is only marijuana, heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. And when I say passive alert, it's either he'll sit or he'll lay when he's actually alerting.
What factors were you aware of that contribute to whether or not a dog is able to recognize and make an alert, detect one?
So all different dogs have different behavior changes. Mine specifically would be like he would do a quick head turn, his mouth would close, his breathing would change, that sort of thing.
Okay. Is the dog able to alert and detect something and alert even after it may no longer be in that area?
Yes, sir.
Why is that?
It's just the odor. If it's the odor still remaining, my dog doesn't alert to narcotics. It just alerts to the odor of narcotics.
All right. So could it be that if your dog does that passive alert, that it could be because there are narcotics that he's trained to detect in that spot, correct?
Yes, sir.
Or could it be that narcotics were there at some point? Is that right?
Yes,
And that the odor is still there?
correct.
So he's detecting to the odor, not necessarily the presence, correct?
Yes, sir. That's
All
correct.
right. Now, when you ran your canine solo on this stop, it did a passive alert. And is it a male or female? I'm sorry.
He's a male.
A male. He made a passive alert at the driver's side door, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Does that mean that there are, well, let me ask it this way. Is that the only place that the dog alerted?
Yes.
Does that mean that the dog is indicating that the odor of narcotics is only at that spot? Or,
Kind of hard to answer. I mean, that's just the spot that he was able to detect
would it
that
indicate
odor.
that it was strongest there,
Yes.
the odor?
Yes, sir.
All right. And do you recall Jeremy Hazelwood was sitting in that spot, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And before you ran your canine, you were on scene, correct?
Yes. Yes, sir.
And the defendant was also at that spot too, correct?
Correct.
Now, while the defendant performed the search of the car, you remained on scene?
I did.
Did you participate in the search in any way?
I did not.
Were you standing close nearby him, watching him search the interior of the car?
I was not.
You're aware that the defendant allegedly seized some methamphetamine in that case, correct?
Correct.
Did he show it to you?
No, sir. Not to my knowledge.
A couple other questions, sir. You mentioned that you previously worked with a defendant. I take it you had a fine relationship with him, correct?
Sure.
Do you recall him ever telling you whether or not he had any interest in working in the narcotics division at the sheriff's office?
He's mentioned, in the past that he likes to work narcotics.
Okay. That he would want to work in the narcotics division?
Yes.
Okay. He was not assigned to the narcotics division at that time, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. That's all, Judge.
Mr. Davis?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Do we call you Investigator Jackson or Deputy Jackson?
Investigator's fine.
Okay. Investigator Jackson. So how long have you been an investigator with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office now?
A little under 2 years.
A little under 2 years?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what is the process to get on the narcotics unit?
I just applied for it and was chosen.
Okay. Do you know if Mr. Wester ever applied?
I have no idea.
And how long were you a canine officer?
Almost 2 years.
2 years? And that was with Solo the whole time?
I actually worked 3 separate dogs.
3 dogs over the 2 years?
Yes, sir.
Is that unusual to have that many dogs?
No, Canine Solo actually had a medical issue. That's why we had to retire him. So.
Oh, okay. And as you said, you were there for this stop with Kimberly Hazelwood, correct?
Yes,
And you recall that stop?
I do.
And Mr. Why I just blanked on
Williams?
I'm sorry. I just totally blanked on Mr. Williams' name. I was looking at other names. Sorry about that. But Mr. Williams was asking you some questions about, you walked Solo around the exterior of the car, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I guess the passive signal that he gave was he kind of sat and laid down.
Correct.
So that tells you he has smelled narcotics.
Correct.
And Mr. Williams was also asking you about the location, which was by the driver's door, correct?
Yes.
That's where he alerted?
Yes, sir. That's where he gave me the final alert.
Would the fact that the driver's door window was open, could that make the smell a little stronger that the dog might pick up on it better there?
Yeah, I would say that since the window was down, that might have been the easiest escape route for the odor to escape from the vehicle.
Okay. And once the dog alerts, that gives you probable cause now to search the vehicle, as you understand it, correct?
That's correct.
And if the dog alerts and somebody says, I don't want you searching my car, you can still search it, correct?
Correct.
And during this stop of the Hazelwoods, was there anything that you saw that threw up any red flags about what Mr. Wester was doing during that stop?
No, sir.
The fact that Mrs. Hazelwood, who ended up getting arrested, was saying that the drugs aren't mine and was kind of protesting and saying, I don't know anything about this, did that seem odd to you?
Not at the time.
Okay. Because
It's not uncommon for people not to claim the narcotics.
Okay. So when she was saying, I don't know anything about this, you weren't concerned that Mr. Wester was planning something?
No, sir.
And you're currently working narcotics.
Yes.
Do you still see a lot of methamphetamine in Jackson County?
I do.
How often? Weekly?
Weekly.
Almost
I mean,
daily?
Almost daily, yeah.
Almost daily, you're investigating somebody in this county for methamphetamine.
Yes.
You can have just a moment. No further questions.
Mr. Williams?
Mr. Davis asked you if you saw any red flags while you were on scene, correct?
Correct.
Well, did you have any particular reason to be watching Deputy Wester perform that search that closely?
No, sir, I didn't.
All right, nothing else.
Mr. Jackson, you are subject to recall in this case in case we need to talk with you again. Don't talk with anybody about what you testified to and here are the questions you were asked until the case is completely over. Okay, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right, good luck to you.
Judge, may Mr. Davis and I approach for the next witness?
Mr. Williams, who would you like to call next?
Jeremiah Bortle?
Jeremiah Bortle. Mr. Bortle, if you'll raise your right hand.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to give the whole truth, nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir, I do.
All right, you can sit down, sir. Mr. Bortle, we've got a little unusual arrangement today. Your jury's out here, so you're speaking to them. Make sure you speak close enough to the mic so everybody can hear you. If you hear an objection, pause your testimony and I'll instruct you, okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Williams.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you state your name for the record?
My name is Jeremiah Bortle. Last name is Bortle.
How are you employed, Mr. Bortle?
I work at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and I'm the supervisor of the evidence or seized drug evidence section and seized drug section of the laboratory.
Okay. I'd like to ask you here today about your, specifically your use in the drug chemistry section. Would you briefly describe your education and training and experience in that area, in that field of FDLE?
I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry from University of West Florida. I also underwent 9 months training with FDLE in the identification of controlled substances, and I have approximately 20 years of experience in the identification of controlled substances with FDLE.
And are you aware through that training and experience of the methods used by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to test specifically for methamphetamine and for cannabis or marijuana?
Yes.
Okay, and generally describe to the jury, I know those are two different methods, could you describe first maybe the method used by FDLE and that you've used for testing for methamphetamine?
Methamphetamine is usually a powder or crystalline substance, so for any crystalline powders or tablet or liquid cases, we usually use a series of instrumental analyses, specifically mass spectrometry and gas chromatography for analysis purposes.
Okay, what does all that mean? That sounds complicated.
Mass spectrometry is an instrument that basically fragments a substance at the molecular level. It gives a graph bar graph, like a fingerprint of how the item is, of how the chemical is bonded uniquely together. And then it gives, and you can compare that to a known standard.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So you do have known standards of, for instance, methamphetamine that you then can compare that data against to see if it is that item?
Yes.
Okay. And is that method that you use, that you've testified to, is that a generally accepted, commonly used method for detection of methamphetamine in this field?
Yes, it is.
And have you used it before?
Yes.
In 20 years, how many times do you think you've used it?
Well into the thousands.
All right. And you have a supervisory role in that section as well?
I do.
You supervise the other analysts who perform that kind of testing?
Yes, I do.
All right. How about for cannabis or marijuana?
Cannabis is a little bit different. We perform a microscopic examination as well as a chemical color test. Our hair arrangement on the cannabis plant is unique to the cannabis plant, so under the microscope we look for a specific hair arrangement, and the chemical color test is also unique for the active ingredients of the cannabis plant, or THC. It turns a purple in presence of THC.
The methods used for detecting cannabis, are those commonly used and accepted within this field as well?
Yes, they are.
And have you performed that kind of testing analysis
Yes.
before?
Yes, I have.
All right. Specifically, did you and the chemistry analysts that work under your supervision, did they test items of evidence allegedly seized from people in this case?
Yes.
And did you receive those? They were forwarded to you from Special Agent Chase, correct?
Some of them were, and some of them were sent in from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office.
I'd like to ask you about them and the test performed on them one by one, so if you'll be patient. Reports were generated showing the results of each individual analysis, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and those have been previously entered into evidence in this case. What I'll do, Mr. Bortle, is I'll list the exhibit number that we have here in the court system, and then for you, do you have those reports in front of you?
I do.
For you, I'll reference the date of the report, and I'll ask about the item number, okay?
Okay.
All right. First, I'd like to ask you about what should be State's Exhibit 2D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Joshua Manuel. It should be dated April 20th of 2018. Do you have that?
I do.
FDLE item number 1 with a description of white powder, was that tested with the methods that you described to the jury?
Yes.
All right. And was a result able to be determined?
Yes.
What was that?
That the item contained methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you now about a test performed and documented on State's Exhibit 3D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Reginald Williams. It should be dated October 13th of 2017. Do you have that in front of you as well?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about items number 1 and 2, specifically described as a white crystalline material and a plant material, respectively. Were those tested?
They were tested.
Were those tested with the same 2 methods that you've described to the jury?
Yes.
What was the result for number 1?
The result for number 1 was that there were no controlled substances per Florida statutes indicated or identified.
I'm sorry?
There was no no controlled substance under Florida statute 893.03 identified.
And what about for item number 2?
The same result, no controlled substances per Florida statute 893.03 were identified.
Just so we're clear, Mr. Bortle, when there's a finding that it's not controlled, does that mean that it's not what we would call a drug or a controlled substance here in Florida?
No, it just means that it's not controlled substance under the Florida statute.
Okay. Well, that's what I mean, under a Florida statute, correct?
Yes, it's not a controlled substance under Florida statute. That's what that means.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's move on. I'd like to ask you now about what has been entered into evidence as State's Exhibit 4D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Stephen Van. It should be dated June 1st of 2018. Do you have that?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about the analysis on FDLE item number 1, described as white powder. Were you able, or was there a test performed on that like you previously described to the jury?
Yes.
Were there findings?
Yes.
What was the result?
The item contained methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 5D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Trevor Day. It should be dated July 27th of 2018. Do you have that?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1, described as a clear crystalline material. Was a test and analysis performed on that?
Yes.
What was the result?
The result was that the item contained methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you now about State's Exhibit 6D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Richard Driggers, specifically dated March 21st of 2018. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE items number 1 and 2, both described as white powder. Was the same kind of testing and analysis performed on FDLE items number 1 and 2?
Yes.
What was the finding and the result for FDLE item number 1?
FDLE item number 1 gave an insufficient result for a controlled substance. So it was inconclusive based upon the amount of substance there.
You said that that was based on the amount of this substance there. Does that mean that there was an insufficient amount to test?
Yes, there was an insufficient amount for identification. That's correct.
Is there a certain quantity of a substance for a white powder that you would need to compare?
Yes, we have what's called an analytical threshold on our instrumentation. If the instrumental response does not give to that threshold, then it's not qualified for identification purposes.
Okay. So is it fair to say then that the result is not saying that it is or is not a controlled substance, correct?
It's saying that it's inconclusive. That's correct.
Okay. Merely that it hasn't met a quantitative analytical threshold, correct?
Correct.
All right. What about FDLE item number 2, also described as white powder on that report?
That substance was identified as methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 7D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Joshua Clenny, dated May 15th of 2018. Do you have that as well?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1, described as clear and white crystalline powder. Was that same testing and analysis performed on that item?
Yes, it was.
And what was the result?
The result is that the item contained methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 8D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Benjamin Bowling, dated November 29th, 2017. Specifically, item number 1, described as white powder. Was the same testing and analysis performed on that?
Yes, it was.
Was there a result?
Yes.
What was it?
The result was that the item contained methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 9D, an FDLE, an FDLE laboratory report dated, related to Teresa Odom, dated April 4th, 2018. You have that in front of you as well?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1, described as a white substance. Was that same testing performed on that?
Yes, it was.
What was the result?
The result was the item contained methamphetamine.
Stop real quick. I'm sorry, it was the computer went off. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 11D, an FDLE laboratory report related to Derek Benefield, dated November 29th, 2017. Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1, described as white powder. Was the same testing and analysis performed on that item?
Yes.
What was the result?
The item contained methamphetamine.
I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 12D, an FDLE laboratory report related to James Christopher Fears should be dated July 17th of 2017. Do you have that?
I have one July 17th of 2018 under that same subject.
I'm sorry, that's my error. 2018 under the same subject, Mr. Fears, correct?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1 described as clear crystals. Was that same testing performed on that?
Yes, it was.
And what was the result?
That item contained methamphetamine.
Lastly, I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 13D's in 2 parts. First, I'm asking about 13D1, an FDLE laboratory report related to Kimberly Hazelwood dated July 17th of 2018. Do you have that?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1, described as white powder. Was that testing performed on that item?
Yes, it was.
What was the result?
The item contained methamphetamine.
Now I'd like to ask you about State's Exhibit 13D2, also related to, also an FDLE laboratory report related to Kimberly Hazelwood. Should be a report dated September 17th of 2018. Do you have that?
I do.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 1, described as unknown residue. Was that testing performed on that?
Yes, it was.
And what was the result?
The item contained methamphetamine.
That's all I have, Judge.
Mr. Davis?
No questions.
Mr. Bortle, do y'all want to keep Mr. Bortle?
Yes, I need to.
Okay. Mr. Bortle, you still are under subpoena. You may be recalled in this case. You're not to talk with anybody about your testimony today or the questions you're asked. Do you understand, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you, sir. Have a good day. State, who would you like to call next?
Melissa Seiffert.
Melissa Seiffert? Raise your right hand, ma'am.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to
Ms. Seifert, you can sit down, ma'am. Thank you. Ms. Seifert, out where the audience normally sits is where our jury's sitting for this trial. If you'll speak loud enough that they can hear you, please try to speak as close to the microphone as possible. Also, if you hear an objection, if you'll pause your testimony, I'll instruct you, okay?
Thank you.
Mr. Williams?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you state your name for the record?
My name is Melissa Seiffert.
And how are you employed?
I'm employed with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the biology section as the Crime Laboratory Analyst Supervisor.
Okay. And what does that entail? What kind of testing or analysis would that section perform and that you would supervise?
The biology section is responsible for examining items of evidence for the possible presence of biological fluids such as blood, semen, saliva, and also for cells and tissues. Those samples are then collected and the DNA process is performed on them in the attempts to develop DNA profiles. We also examine reference standard or known sources of DNA from individuals in the case And then we compare those results, and we issue a report as to our findings, and we testify in court when appropriate.
Briefly describe your education and training that you've had to have that position.
I graduated from the University of West Florida in 2005 with a Bachelor's of Science degree in pre-professional biology. I began my career with Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or FDLE, in 2006 as a crime laboratory technician, where I took in evidence from our local law enforcement agencies. A few months later, I was promoted as a forensic tech in biology, where I assisted analysts in examining items of evidence for bodily fluids. Approximately a year after that, I was promoted again to what's called a screening forensic tech, and this allowed me to do independent casework for bodily fluids, and I issued reports and testified in court. I did that for approximately 5 to 6 years. After that, I was promoted to a DNA analyst, and I went through a training program. I went through a training program for the crime lab technicians and the forensic tech positions as well. But once you're a DNA analyst, the training program gets a little more intense. And that involved 2 phases. The first phase being written, book work, written exams, oral examinations, and like hands-on practical tests. And in the areas that I do DNA analysis in, so DNA methodologies, statistical analysis, and DNA interpretation. Once I completed that, I moved on to what's called supervised casework. That's phase 2. And that entailed working cases, real cases, under the direction of a crime laboratory analyst. Once I completed that, I was certified as a crime lab analyst. I did that job for approximately 6 years, and then I was promoted to the section supervisor in Pensacola over the DNA lab, and that was in January of 2019. And that job entails me overseeing the day-to-day operations of our biology DNA section, as well as case management.
Would you describe to the jury what method your section uses for the detection of possible DNA?
Yes. First of all, we screen items of evidence. We take samples, and we take samples of evidentiary samples for DNA testing. And what we do first is an extraction process. The extraction process is to actually get the DNA out of the cells, and we use chemicals and heat to do that. The next part of the process is to find out how much DNA is actually present in a sample, and that's called a quantitation step. And that's very important for us to know in order to perform what's called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. And polymerase chain reaction is actually the technology where we add chemicals and we add heat. And what that does is it allows us to make millions and millions of copies of specific areas of our DNA in order to develop a DNA profile. And once we have done this amplification process, the DNA sample then goes on to what's called a genetic analyzer, in which it runs, and we are able to actually visualize the DNA profiles and make comparisons.
All right, is the method that you've described to the jury for the testing for the presence of DNA and eventual comparison, is that generally accepted and relied on within your field?
Yes, it is.
Have you performed that type of testing before?
I have.
Have you testified about it in court before?
Yes, I have.
I'd like to take a step back and just get a general description for the jury. I mean, we've all heard the term DNA, but just generally describe it for the jury.
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's commonly referred to as our genetic blueprint. So what that means is it says, hey, you have 1 head, 2 arms, 2 legs, a body, green eyes, you're a boy, you're a girl, and among other things. And it's found in every single cell of our body. It does not change throughout your lifetime. It is unique to each person. No 2 people have the same DNA profile with the exception of identical siblings. And it's passed down from parent to child. So half of your DNA comes from your mother, the other half comes from your father.
How is you mentioned that it's in everyone's cells, every one of their cells, correct?
Yes.
How is it then that DNA can be left on an object after I'm no longer touching it? So for instance, this lectern here.
So you have skin cells that are on the surface of your body, and those skin cells, they come off. So when you are touching something, a counter or a pencil or really anything, there's the potential to leave those skin cells or what's called epithelial cells behind.
What kinds of factors contribute to, in this example, me leaving my skin cells on this lectern?
There's various factors that contribute to that. One, how long was a person handling the item? You know, picking something up and putting it down, that could leave some DNA, but how much depends on maybe, is the person sweating? Does the person have any type of bodily fluids on their person, on their hand? Is it a hot, humid day? Did they just wash their hands, or have they not washed their hands in a while? There's a lot of factors that contribute to how much or how little DNA is left behind, as well as the object itself. So for instance, if you have something, say, you know, a smooth metal bar, and you just handle it for a minute and put it down, you might not leave a whole bunch of DNA behind. But if you have something that is nice and ridged and you've really needed to use it to, you know, say change a tire, and it's ridged, the potential of the friction of your hand can leave behind more DNA than if you only touched it or touched a smooth surface.
What about porous items as well? Well, specifically what I mean is, you know, let's say clothing. Now my jacket. Now we're away from this lectern, but we're onto this jacket here. What about that?
So there's a term called touch DNA. And it's a broad term that encompasses several different types. One type is called wearer DNA, and that's the DNA that is rubbed off onto things that you wear. Your clothes, your jacket, you know, the back of your jacket rubs the back of your neck or the back of your collar, your underarms, maybe your cuffs, your pants. Anything that you might wear would be considered wearer DNA, and those items and the way that they're worn are good ways to catch DNA, if you will. Then there's another term called handler DNA. And handler DNA is something like a screwdriver. If you were, or, you know, a tire iron, if you were changing a car, you're handling that, you're constantly touching it. And then there's something called brief contact DNA, and that's basically picking something up and putting it down.
Can DNA, so you've described a situation where it can be transferred from me to this lectern or from me to this jacket. Mm-hmm. Can DNA also be transferred, though, from, so for instance, me to this lectern to this gentleman over here, if he were to come over, the clerk, and then touch this lectern? Can it be transferred beyond that?
Yes, there's something called secondary transfer, and it's where an item is, say an item is touched, and then that DNA from that touched item can be transferred to another place or person.
And I would like to ask you, have you had a chance to view State's Exhibit 9F, which is a disc of a body camera video related to a search of a Teresa Odom?
Yes, I have.
Okay. I'd like to ask you, specifically during the search of the interior of her truck, were you able to see observe any factors which may contribute to that type of transfer?
Well, there were several factors that I did see. One was the use of non-single-use gloves. The individual in the video had on like cloth-type gloves, and they seem to have come from the car, the officer's car. And so that one right there, I would assume that that officer would have their DNA on those gloves. And then in the video, I couldn't really see much, but there was a little baggie found, and it looked that baggie had touched a spoon, and it had touched the seat of the car. So because of that, there's DNA on both, there's potentially DNA on both of those items. So there is the potential from the officer's DNA being transferred to the little the little plastic bag, as well as the owner of the vehicle or owners. It could be whoever drove that vehicle right then, or maybe people who drove it before, that DNA being transferred onto that bag as well.
Okay, based on these and other observations you saw in the video, would you expect a certain amount or a certain likelihood of cross-contamination of DNA if those items had been tested?
The expectation would be, because of the non-single-use gloves, to potentially have whoever was wearing those gloves to see their DNA on that baggie, as well as the DNA of whomever's truck it was, whoever was sitting there, whoever used that spoon. And then there was another portion of the video in which the baggie had fallen onto the concrete, like the asphalt of the, I think it was the road. And there's a potential, if there was some kind of DNA on that particular piece of asphalt, that it could also transfer.
And of course, this type of testing, you've described what benefits it could have or what it could tell us, but ultimately your type of testing cannot tell us for what purpose something may have been handled by someone, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Nothing else, Judge.
Mr. Davis?
So was it because of the potential for the cross-contamination that you didn't do any testing?
That is one aspect, yes.
Okay. What were some of the other reasons why you didn't do any DNA testing on these items?
Another main reason was that this particular case was considered a drug case, and that is not something that our biology section typically does, especially for just touch DNA cases.
But you do have the capabilities, you could have done the touch DNA testing.
I could have approved the exception, yes.
Okay, but that didn't happen in this case.
No, this, in my opinion, was not a DNA case.
Thank you.
Anything else, Mr. Williams?
No, Judge.
Ms. Seiffert, you are subject to recall. If you'll just refrain from talking about your testimony today and anything you heard in the courtroom, okay, ma'am? Thank
Yes,
you, ma'am. Who would the state like to call?
Can we approach where the next witness is called?
Sure. Who would the state call?
Barbara Mcglamory-Evans.
Mcglamory-Evans. Raise your right hand, ma'am.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth.
Thank you, ma'am. You can be seated. Ma'am, our jury is out to your right, so you're going to need to speak directly into the microphone where they can hear you. The second thing is if you hear an objection, pause your testimony and I'll instruct you. Okay, Mr. Williams?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you please state your name for the record?
My name is Dr. Barbara Mcglamory-Evans.
How are you employed?
I'm employed with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at the Pensacola Regional Operations Center as a crime laboratory analyst in the latent print section.
Would you briefly describe your training and experience you've received to work in that section?
Yes, prior to becoming a latent print examiner, I worked for FDLE in the biometric identification section where I conducted latent print comparisons using the computer system. When I transferred into my current position, I underwent a 1.5-year training program, which included reading articles from scientific journals, as well as hands-on practical exercises, competency testing, and conducting casework underneath the supervision of a qualified analyst. When I was completed with training, I took a competency test to ensure that all my skills were proficient, and then I was certified as a latent print examiner through FDLE.
How long have you been certified as a latent print examiner with FDLE?
Let's see. Well, my training program was 1.5 years, and I've been in my current position for 7 years now, so about 5.5 years.
Are you familiar with the methods used to examine an item for a latent print?
Yes.
Okay. Would you briefly describe to the jury how that's done? What method you use to test for a latent print on an object?
It depends on the type of evidence. If it is a non-porous evidence, meaning that it does not absorb water, so something like plastic or glass, I first visually examine it, and then I would conduct a super glue fuming, after which I apply a fluorescent dye stain and then powder. For a porous item, which is something like paper, cardboard, something that can absorb water, I use different chemical processing techniques such as anhydride and physical developer.
Okay, and have you performed those type of tests in your experience with FDLE working in that section?
Yes, I have.
Roughly how many times do you think you've performed those tests?
I'm really not sure. It's a lot.
And is that those tests that you described to the jury, are those generally relied on in the field of latent print examination?
Yes, they are.
And have you testified in court about your use of those before?
Yes, I have.
I'd like to ask you what factors contribute to whether or not a latent fingerprint may be left on an item.
It depends on several factors. The person who's leaving the latent print, their skin, because a latent print is composed of normally perspiration or oily contaminants from touching head and face, and so when somebody leaves a latent print behind on an object, it really depends on their condition of their hands and what residue is present on that, as well as the substrate itself. If it's something very textured, it might not be conducive for receiving that latent print residue. Also, the condition of the item, how it's handled, if it's put in and out of pockets a lot or anything like that, it'll rub the prints off. Environmental factors can also have an effect on whether a latent print's left on an item or whether it can be developed.
Due to those factors that you just described, both on the item itself and the person's hands, their fingers, is it fair to say that just because someone touches something, their fingerprints may not be on that, may not be left on that, such that you could examine them, identify them?
Yes, that's fair to say.
Did you perform any testing for latent prints on the items allegedly seized from the victims in this case?
I did receive items of evidence for this case.
All right, and did you perform that kind of testing to see if you could find latent prints suitable for comparison on them?
Yes, I did.
All right, and you weren't able to find any suitable for comparison, correct?
No, I was not.
All right. Now, what does that mean for the jury? If you are unable to find any suitable for comparison, tell them what that means.
So when I am looking for latent prints and I find what we refer to as ridge detail, ridge detail is from the raised portions of skin that's known as friction ridge skin. I look for factors, unique factors that can be identified to one person or another. If there's not enough information, so a very, very small area was left, but there's just not enough information for me to identify somebody or exclude them, then I will say that that print is no value for comparison purposes.
Is there essentially both a qualitative and a quantitative standard that must be met for you to perform an examination?
Yes, there must be sufficient information in the print that goes to quality and quantity of what's left or there on the surface.
Okay. So out of all the seized items that you've examined in this case, none of them had any suitable for comparison, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you mentioned ridge detail. Did some of them, however, have no ridge detail at all
Yes.
during your examination? Okay, I'd like to ask you about some specific ones, if you'll give me a moment. You generated reports documenting your findings of your examinations in this case, correct?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you first about a report dated December 12th, 2019, and FDLE item number 26 on that report,
Okay.
okay? Related to a seized item related to Stephen Van, described as a black in color baggie. Was there any ridge detail that you could discover on that item?
According to my notes, no.
I'd like to ask you next about a report dated September 30th of 2020. Item number 40, FDLE item number 47. Was the testing performed on that item?
Yes.
Okay, specifically aluminum foil related to Richard Driggers. Was there any ridge detail on that item?
No.
Next, I'd like to ask you about a report dated January 26th of 2021. FDLE item number 51, a yellow in color cut straw related to Joshua Clenny. Was there any ridge detail on that item?
No, there was not.
Next, I'd like to ask you about 3 items, all contained on the same report dated December 12th of 2019. There are FDLE items 23, 24, and 25, all described as a clear plastic baggie with meth residue related to Benjamin Bowling. Was there any ridge detail on those items?
No, there was not.
Next, I'd like to ask you about a separate report, separate submission, but the same date, which is December 12th of 2019, FDLE item number 22, a clear plastic baggie related to Teresa Odom. Was there any ridge detail on that item?
No, there was not.
I'd like to ask you about FDLE item number 30 on that same report, a clear plastic baggie with meth related to Derek Benefield. Was there any ridge detail on that item?
No.
And lastly, I'd like to ask you about a report from April 23rd of 2020, an FDLE item number 43, a clear plastic container with a blue metal lid related, to James Christopher Fears. Was there any ridge detail on that item?
No.
You described what factors on somebody's skin, oil or sweat and their unique fingerprints could be affected being left on that item due to that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Can that oil or sweat showing those fingerprints, based on your experience, be transferred through a glove?
Not generally, but it can happen where somebody has gloves on, they touch their face, and then say that they touch the item, that it can actually still leave a print.
Okay. Let me ask it this way: if how would it be transferred through the glove? Let me ask it that way. What factors would contribute to being their fingerprint actually transferring through a glove?
In that instance, no, the fingerprint doesn't exactly transfer through the glove. What happens as I was describing, is that when somebody has a glove on, if they don't have the textured fingertips of the gloves, if they're just regular types of gloves, that doesn't have any other kind of barrier, then when they touch their face or whatever, then they can actually still transfer their ridge detail onto an item, even though they have gloves on.
Okay. Not thick textured gloves, correct?
Right.
All right, thank you. Nothing else, Judge.
Mr. Davis?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you.
Just a couple questions for you. So you've been a latent print examiner with FDLE, you said, for approximately about 5.5 years now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so, Mr. Williams went through a bunch of different reports and items with you, and you were not able to develop any prints on any of these items, correct?
I didn't develop any prints of value for comparison.
Okay.
The items that he listed are ones that no ridge detail was developed at all.
Okay. So there was nothing to even see on those.
Right.
And then there were others, may have been some, but not enough to analyze to make a comparison.
Correct.
Okay. And there are different factors that come in as to why you wouldn't be able to do that, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
The type of surface that you talked about. Or what about other items coming in contact with those items?
That can potentially wipe away the prints as well if there's too much contact with the surface.
And then if somebody was handling an item with some cloth gloves on, that could wipe the fingerprint off, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What about the time of year? Does that have anything to do with how fingerprints may be left?
Environmental factor does play a role, so if it's too hot, too humid, it can potentially cause the prints to rub away.
And then what about people that work with their hands? Like, say I've been a construction worker for 20 years and could I have less ridges to leave fingerprints that way?
Yes.
What about somebody that smokes? Does that have any influence on fingerprinting?
I'm not sure about people that smoke. It's normally because of occupation.
Okay. Well, what about somebody that's, works around heat a lot or their hands around heat a lot? Could that also diminish the ridges?
If they're being burned, absolutely, it can cause like blistering or scarring on the fingers, but there probably would be some ridge detail there.
Okay. And just because you examined something and you cannot find any prints on it, that doesn't mean somebody didn't touch it, correct?
That's correct.
So I'm standing here holding this pen. You would expect to find my fingerprints on it. If I'm doing this and my hands are a little moist, and you would expect to be able to develop my prints from this pen, correct?
Correct.
So then if if it gets wiped off and set down and I don't touch it again, and you test it and you don't find my prints, you can't say, Ryan Davis never touched that pen. You can only, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. You can only say, I didn't find his prints on it. I can't say that he never touched it.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. You ever heard of the saying, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence?
I have not heard that saying before, but
But does it make sense to what we were just talking about?
yes.
Okay. Nothing further. Thank you.
Mr. Williams?
Nothing else, Judge?
Ma'am, you're going to be subject to recall, which means the state or defense may want to talk to you again in this case, so please don't discuss your testimony here today until this case is over, okay? Thank
Yes,
you,
sir.
ma'am. Appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
State, let's get one more in before we take our afternoon recess.
Yes, sir.
Who would you like to call?
Scott Edwards?
Scott Edwards. Jury, we will take our afternoon break after this one. Raise your right hand, sir.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the evidence you're about?
Good afternoon, Mr. Edwards. You can sit down. Thank you, sir. Mr. Edwards, our jury is sitting out here today, so if you'll speak to that group and make sure you're speaking into the mic where we can hear you. If you hear an objection, if you'll just pause your testimony and I'll instruct you how to proceed. Okay, sir?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Williams?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you state your name for the record?
Scott Edwards.
And how are you employed?
I'm currently employed with Lynn Haven Police.
All right. And from the period of 2016 to 2018, how are you employed?
I was with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office.
And at that time, were you assigned to the narcotics division?
Yes, I was the captain over that division at that time.
Very generally, what's the narcotics division tasked with at that time? What would you guys do?
So any narcotics investigation, any tips, things of that nature, we would investigate, conduct search warrants, arrest on any drug violations.
Okay. When you talked about tips, would you rely on tips that were sometimes related from other deputies?
Yes,
Sometimes those come from patrol deputies during normal traffic stops where they made a drug arrest?
correct.
And at the time that you were in narcotics, that period that we've described, were there, at the sheriff's office, were there benefits in pay to being in that division?
Can you repeat that
Were there
again?
benefits in pay to working in narcotics at that time? Did you get more money?
From a patrol deputy, yes. You got like a increase of $1,000, $1,500.
Okay. And was there, due to the nature of the work, was there a likelihood of overtime pay being available?
Sometimes, yes.
At that time, did the narcotics division generally work in plain clothes
Yes,
compared to the uniform that you're in right now, correct?
correct.
Was there, at the time you were in it, in that agency, a general prestige to being in that division versus, let's say, being a patrol deputy?
Some would say yes.
Okay. Generally, would you get to do more working in that division than you would do a greater diversity of work, different things, than just what a patrol deputy would do?
I would say yes.
Now, how would somebody get into the narcotics division at that time?
Well, depending on if we had an opening, of course. During that time, it may just be an appointment by the sheriff. It may be, I can't remember if we had interviews back then or not, to be honest.
Would, due to the nature of the type of work you were doing, was proactivity something that you would look at in any role you had in getting somebody in narcotics?
Yes,
You would want a proactive
Sure.
deputy, correct?
absolutely.
Sure. Did you have a chance to know the defendant, Zachary Wester, when he was working at the sheriff's office?
I did,
Did you consider him to be a proactive deputy,
yes,
specifically in making drug arrests?
yes.
Did the defendant ever provide you any informants or any tips from those he arrested during traffic stops in his duties?
Not me specifically, and if he,
Mr. Edwards, you've answered. Go to the next question, counsel. Thank you.
That's all my questions, Judge.
All right, Mr. Davis?
Good afternoon, Mr. Edwards. So how long were you actually with the Jackson County Sheriff's Office?
29 years,
Did you say 29?
29,
Okay.
yes, sir.
So you were there a lot longer than 2016 to 2018,
Oh, yeah.
but you were there that period.
During that time, I was the narcotics supervisor as well as the criminal investigation supervisor.
Okay. And how long were you the supervisor of those sections?
I think about 3 years.
Okay. And Mr. Williams asked you about pay increase, and you said about 1,000 to 1,500. Was that per year?
Yeah, that was on top of a deputy's pay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if a deputy is making $30,000 a year and they become a narcotics investigator, then it'd be $31,000, $31,500 a year.
Correct.
Okay, so we're not talking about $1,000 or $1,500 a month.
No.
Okay. And you said you did, so you knew Mr. Wester when he was working as a patrol deputy, correct?
Yes.
And he did make some drug arrests, correct?
Correct.
Was he the only patrol deputy making drug arrests?
No.
Okay. What about Trevor Lee?
I know Trevor Lee.
Okay. Was Trevor Lee also a proactive deputy?
He was.
Did he make a lot of drug arrests?
Yes.
Did he become a drug investigator in your unit?
Not under my,
Not while you were there? Okay. Would he have been the type of deputy you wanted to be on your drug unit?
sure.
Okay. You also talked about you were also the head of another, was it the criminal?
Criminal Investigations Division. Yes.
Okay, sometimes referred to as CID?
Correct.
Okay. And in CID, would, if a road deputy was going into CID, could they expect maybe that same $1,000 to $1,500
That
per
is
year?
correct.
Okay. And they would also sometimes get to work overtime?
Yeah, not near as much as probably the dope unit, but yes.
Okay. Did the CID investigators also wear plain clothes?
Yes.
Okay. And they would have kind of other different types of things that they would get to do as well?
Correct.
Okay. And when did you leave the Jackson County Sheriff's Office?
I retired September of 2020.
And it looks like you didn't want to stay retired too long.
Correct.
I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Williams?
Nothing else, Judge.
Mr. Edwards, you may be recalled in this case. So if you'll-
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Am I free to leave?
Today, yes, sir, you are. Have a good day. Thank you. All right, it's 2:45. It's a great time for our afternoon break. Jury, leave your blue notepads in your chairs, leave your juror badges on, don't talk with each other, don't talk with anybody, don't do any research, don't look up anything in regards to this case. We're going to be in recess for about 15 minutes. If you'll be back in the jury room at 3 o'clock. Mr. Bailiff?
All rise.